In the summer of 1987, a small aluminum boat slipped quietly into the waters of Pine Hollow Lake and never came back. No distress call, no wreckage, no bodies. Just a grandmother and her grandson vanished without a ripple. And for 20 years, no one could explain what happened until a fisherman wandered into a dry creek bed and found something that was never supposed to be there. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Sarah Whitlow. I was 37 that year, living in Lansing, working full-time at the DMV, raising my son Caleb on my own after the divorce. Life wasn't perfect, but it was steady. We had a rhythm. Mondays were groceries, Thursdays were laundromat runs, and the summers always belonged to my mother, June Whitlow. My mom lived 2 hours north on the edge of Pine Hollow Lake. She'd been up there nearly her whole life in the same white house with green shutters and a flagpole out front. After my dad passed in '85, she didn't slow down much. Fishing, gardening, church on Sundays, that was her pace. She was proud, independent. Still mowed her own lawn at 72. Every June, Caleb would go up to stay with her for a few weeks. She'd let him stay up late, bake too many cookies, teach him how to bait a hook. He loved it. And it gave me a break. A real break, not the kind where you're just juggling fewer things. I trusted her with everything. Always had. That summer, Mom had a plan. She was going to teach Caleb how to fish from her old aluminum boat, the same one she used to take my dad out in when they were first married. She'd even bought Caleb a bright orange life jacket and mailed me a Polaroid of him wearing it in the driveway, grinning like a fool. I still have that picture. June 15th started like any other morning. She called me at 7:00 sharp, told me they were headed to the North Cove where the bass were biting. Said they packed sandwiches, grape soda, and an old photo album to look through between casts. Caleb loved hearing about his granddad, said it made the lake feel like a family tradition, not just a trip. Around 10:30, a neighbor named Marlene saw them loading the boat at the launch. Mom waved, hollered that they'd be back by dinner with a mess of fish. Caleb was bouncing around in that orange vest, too excited to stand still. That was the last time anyone saw either of them. When 6:00 rolled around and the phone didn't ring, I didn't panic. Not right away. Sometimes Mom would lose track of time out on the water, especially if the fish were biting. By 8:00, I told myself they probably stopped for burgers on the way home. But by 9:00, I was in my car, driving north with white knuckles and a pit in my stomach I couldn't explain. The boat launch was dark when I got there. Too dark. No voices, no engine hum. Just the sound of water tapping the shore and that old blue truck parked neatly beside an empty trailer. And somewhere out there beyond the fog and the black tree line was my son. It was just after 10:15 when I called the sheriff's office. I'd already circled the launch lot twice, walked the shoreline with a flashlight, and called out their names until my throat burned. The lake was so still that night it felt wrong. No boats, no wind, no ripple of water. Just the thick hum of summer bugs and my heart pounding in my ears. Within the hour, a deputy showed up in a dusty cruiser. Young guy. Looked no older than 25. He took my statement down with a clipboard and a kind of tired detachment I didn't hold against him yet. He radioed for search and rescue, but even before they arrived, I could tell he already had a theory forming. A late return, maybe. A mechanical issue. Maybe they pulled ashore somewhere and fell asleep under the stars. But that wasn't June, and it wasn't Caleb. By midnight, a couple more vehicles had rolled in rescue volunteers, one of them carrying a thermos and a box of donuts like it was a routine call. They launched 2 aluminum boats with spotlights and ran slow, quiet sweeps across the cove. I stood at the edge of the dock, arms folded so tight across my chest they started to cramp, eyes fixed on every beam of light that moved across the water. They didn't find anything that first night. No boat, no floating cooler, not even a scrap of fishing line. just open water and fog so thick by 300 a.m. it swallowed the trees across the lake. At dawn, a sheriff's lieutenant introduced himself Randy, something I think, and said they were expanding the search. More boats, a few cadaver dogs, helicopter if the fog lifted. He was respectful calm, but I could feel the quiet clock ticking behind his eyes. After 12 hours, these things shifted, moved from urgency to paperwork, from panic to process. I don't remember eating that first day. I remember people bringing coffee. I remember someone handing me a blanket. I remember standing next to my mother's pickup truck for what felt like hours, just staring at the empty trailer. By day 3, the search had grown. News vans arrived from the next county over. A few local fishermen brought out their own boats to help. Someone from the fire department brought sonar equipment, though one of the older volunteers told me it wouldn't be much help with a lake that deep and wild. Pine Hollow isn't one of those manicured state park lakes. It's old, almost prehistoric in places. Cold springs under the surface, drop-offs that plunge 40 feet without warning. My mother used to say it had moods. She said the lake didn't always give back what it took. Still, we hoped. I remember watching a helicopter skim just above the treetops, running a tight grid while a sheriff's diver marked off points on a laminated map. They searched all the obvious places, the rocky edges, the inlet channels, the southern spillway. Then they moved into the deeper water. They even walked the surrounding woods side by side in orange vests, heads down, like they were looking for lost keys. But there was nothing. No overturned boat, no debris, no life jackets. By Friday morning, I started hearing it in their voices. That quiet shift from, "we're gonna find them," to, "we don't know where else to look." It was Saturday when they finally found something on the far end of the lake, past the private camps, tucked back in a narrow cove I didn't even know existed. One of the game wardens spotted it half submerged in the reeds, a small aluminum boat flipped upside down, maybe 15 feet long. I saw the pictures later. The registration number matched my mother's. It had a little scrape down one side, but no holes, no signs of impact or weather damage. And the strangest part, according to the report, was that it was empty. Completely empty. No rods, no tackle box, no lunch cooler. Not even a soggy bag of sandwiches. Just mud pine needles and the faint smell of gasoline. The water in that cove wasn't deep. Maybe waist high. If the boat had drifted there from the main lake, it would have scraped bottom long before. But even if it had capsized out in the open, the rest of their gear should have turned up. Something should have floated. The life jackets at the very least. But nothing did. That was the part that caught in my throat, the silence of it. Like whoever had been in that boat hadn't just fallen out. Like they'd packed everything up and disappeared before it ever flipped. The official explanation came 6 weeks later. The sheriff's department ruled it an accidental drowning. They said June must have suffered a medical episode, maybe a stroke or heart attack, and Caleb tried to help. Maybe he fell in. Maybe she jumped in after him. They couldn't say for sure. And with no bodies, no witnesses, and no signs of foul play, the case was closed. I buried 2 empty coffins the following Sunday. Same church my mother had sung in for 50 years. There were hydrangeas on every pew and a silence so thick during the closing hymn I thought it might crush me. I moved out of Lansing the next year. Too many memories I didn't ask for. Too many questions no one could answer. I took a job in Saginaw and stopped driving north altogether. I didn't visit the lake. Didn't write letters to the sheriff's office. I told myself I accepted what happened. But the truth is, I didn't. Not really. Because there were details, little things that never sat right. Like the angle of the boat when they found it. Like the way all their gear vanished, not drifted, not scattered, just gone. Like the fact that the boat ended up nearly 5 miles from the North Cove where they always fished. And then there were the stories, bits and pieces people brought me over the years. A neighbor who remembered a strange truck parked near the launch. A fisherman who thought he heard yelling across the lake but couldn't be sure. A boy on a dirt bike who said he heard an engine sputtering through the shallows late in the day. None of it meant much at the time. Not to the sheriff's department, not to the search teams. But to me, those fragments stayed lodged in the back of my mind like splinters. Small, but sharp. I didn't know it then, but someone else had started to wonder too. Someone who would look at that boat years later and see what the sheriff never had. But that wouldn't come until much later. For now, all I had was silence. The kind of silence that hums even when you leave the lake behind. The kind that waits. A few weeks after the funerals, I went back to the sheriff's office with a list of questions written in my checkbook register. I'd torn it out, folded it in half, and carried it around for days before I built up the nerve. There were 8 questions, maybe 9. Things like, had they ever searched the creek beds leading off the east end? Was there any evidence the boat had been dragged? Had anyone checked the trails past Bishop's Ridge? I don't know what I expected walking in there like that. Maybe I thought someone would pull me aside and say, "We've been wondering the same things," or that there was a back room full of maps and notes they hadn't shown me before. But what I got was a polite nod and a reference to the official report. The receptionist didn't even ask my name, said the lead investigator had rotated to another county, and if I wanted a copy of the full file, I could submit a records request. I remember standing in the doorway for a second, after she said that, like I hadn't quite heard her right, and then just walking back out to my car. The paper stayed folded in my purse until the ink faded. I never got answers to any of it. After that, folks stopped bringing up my mother and Caleb unless I brought them up first. Friends meant well, but you can feel it in their tone when they're trying to shift the conversation, like grief is contagious. Even the neighbors and Pine Hollow people who'd known my mother for decades started avoiding eye contact when I passed through town. The only one who ever said what I was already thinking was a woman named Marlene Purdy, lived 2 doors down from Mom's place. She and Mom weren't close exactly, but they'd swap zucchini and gossip when they crossed paths. A couple months after everything happened, I stopped by to leave some mail that had been delivered to her by mistake, and as I was turning to leave, Marlene said, "You know, there was a truck." I paused, thinking she meant a delivery or something, but she went on. "Dark blue, or maybe black. Parked just off the launch road that afternoon. Not the usual crowd, just sitting there." She looked away when she said it, like even remembering it made her uncomfortable. I asked if she told anyone. She said she'd mentioned it to the deputy who took her statement, but they hadn't followed up. I figured it didn't mean anything she said. But now, I don't know. I carried that with me for years. Not just the truck, but all the things that didn't quite add up. A guy from the bait shop said he saw the boat launch receipt time-stamped at 10:32 a.m., but by noon another fisherman swore he'd heard a child's voice crying out across the lake. No boat in sight. A boy on a dirt bike said he heard an outboard motor struggling in the shallows around dinner time long after most folks had gone home. But every time I tried to push on these things, I got the same answer, unverified, inconsistent, anecdotal. Nothing actionable. Eventually I stopped asking, but I never stopped wondering. I'd go months without thinking about it. And then, out of nowhere, I'd pass a boat ramp on the side of the road and feel my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Or I'd hear a child laugh in the supermarket, and for half a second, I'd forget that Caleb wasn't 9 years old anymore. There's a kind of silence that settles into your life when something like that happens. It doesn't scream. It doesn't beg for attention. It just sits in the corner and waits for you to notice it again. After I moved to Saginaw, I tried to rebuild some version of normal. Got a new apartment, took up evening shifts to keep busy. I stopped driving north even when friends invited me to camp or fish or just get away for a while. Pine Hollow had become a place I only visited in dreams, usually ones where I was still standing on the dock watching the sun go down, knowing something was wrong but unable to call out. I didn't tell people about my mom or Caleb unless I had to. When I did, I kept it brief. They drowned. It was an accident. That was easier than saying I didn't know what happened. But part of me always thought quietly, privately, that there had to be more to it. Not because I wanted to believe in monsters or conspiracies or any of that, but because I knew my mother. I knew how cautious she was. I knew that she'd had that boat serviced just a week before, that the life jackets were brand new, that she wouldn't have taken Caleb out unless she was sure it was safe. And I knew she'd never leave anything behind in that boat. Not her tackle, not her sandwiches, not the photo album she said she was bringing to show him old fishing trips. So where did it all go? Why was the boat completely empty? I remember one afternoon in late '89, I got a call from a freelance journalist who'd been poking around older missing persons cases in the area. He'd heard about Mom and Caleb through a colleague and asked if I'd be willing to talk. We met at a diner off I-75. He had a notepad full of questions, but none of them were new. No angles I hadn't already chased down in my own head. When I asked what made him interested in their case specifically, he said it was because it was so clean. Most cases like this, he said, they leave a mess. Broken equipment, shoes on the shoreline, something. But this one's tidy. He didn't mean it as comfort. He meant it as a warning. Like the pieces fit too neatly together. Like someone had arranged them to look that way. That conversation stuck with me. It didn't open any doors, but it made it harder to close the ones I'd already left cracked. I started rereading the old press clippings I'd saved, looking at the lake layout on satellite maps, not obsessively, just enough to feel like I was doing something even if it went nowhere. Every so often I'd call the sheriff's department just to check. The responses were always the same. Nothing new. We'll keep your number on file. Sorry, ma'am, the case is closed. It wasn't until years later that I heard a name I hadn't heard before. It came up casually in a conversation I wasn't even part of. I was visiting a friend from high school who'd stayed up in Midland. She mentioned a guy who used to work with the DNR said he was out at Pine Hollow the day everything happened. She didn't remember his name right away, just that he was the kind of person who noticed things other people didn't. It was one of those throwaway comments you almost forget until it comes back to you in the middle of the night like a whisper. I wrote it down on the back of a grocery list Bill used to work DNR. Search volunteer, 1987. I didn't know then that finding him would be the thread that started to unravel the entire story. But I held on to that note like it mattered. Because somewhere beneath all the official lines and polite dismissals, something didn't add up. And I wasn't the only one who'd seen it. I didn't track Bill Whitley down right away. His name sat on a slip of paper for close to a year before I did anything with it. I think part of me was afraid that even if I found him, it'd end up like every other conversation, someone vaguely sympathetic, someone who remembered the search but not much else, someone who'd nod, say it was a tragedy, and then steer things back to the official story. But then one January morning, I was cleaning out an old recipe drawer and found the note again, tucked inside the back of a church bulletin from 1987. Just seeing Caleb's name scribbled in the corner, my own handwriting faded and uneven. Something about that broke whatever had been holding me back. I called the county records office, then the Department of Natural Resources, and finally a retired staff directory for the Forest Service. It took a few calls, but I found him. Bill Whitley, age 71, living in a tan single-story ranch outside of Oscoda. He answered on the first ring. His voice was slower than I expected, raspy but focused. He remembered the search right away. Didn't even need me to finish the sentence. Said he was one of the first volunteers out there after the alert went out. Pine Hollow, he asked like he was pulling it from a locked cabinet. Yeah, I remember that week. Fog came in fast that night. A lot of folks don't know what that lake's like after dark. I asked if I could drive up and speak in person. He said, sure. Just call when you're close, I'll put the coffee on. I got there the next afternoon. Cold, brittle sunlight through the trees, snow packed thin along the edge of his gravel drive. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that seeps into your clothes. Inside it smelled like pine and old carpet. His walls were covered in trail maps and framed wildlife photos, elk loons, a couple of grinning grandkids. Bill sat at the kitchen table, a mug in front of him, a pair of reading glasses dangling from a cord around his neck. He motioned for me to sit. I didn't try to explain why I was there. I just asked if he remembered the eastern creek beds, the ones feeding out of the ridge above the lake. His eyes narrowed just slightly. "Funny you bring that up," he said. "That's the first place I went." He told me about the drought that summer, said water levels were down nearly 4 feet across the region. Whole stretches of shoreline exposed that hadn't seen air in decades. He remembered checking the east inlet on foot that second day, hiking up past the bend toward an old seasonal runoff channel. "That creek was bone dry," he said. "Dry as I've ever seen it. I walked it clean to the mouth. If your mama's boat had ended up there, I'd have seen it." I sat back in my chair, unsure how to respond. I hadn't even mentioned the boat yet, not the one that would be found years later buried under leaves and silt miles from where it should have been. I asked if he remembered a man named Tommy Morrison. Bill smiled faintly. "Fella from Flint. Retired Union guy. Kept to himself mostly. Always fished the far side." I told him what Tommy found. How in 2007 he'd hiked into that same creek bed and spotted something silver wedged between 2 rocks. An aluminum boat, my mother's registration number still faint on the bow. Bill leaned forward, both hands on the table now. "That ain't possible," he said. "That whole area was dry in '87, and even if it hadn't been, there's no way a boat could drift up there. Current wouldn't carry it that far, and the land between's too rough to drag anything without leaving signs." He looked out the window for a long time after that, eyes tracking something only he could see. Then he said, "You're right to still be asking questions." He told me he never bought the drowning theory, not entirely. Said there were details that got overlooked or ignored because folks didn't want to consider anything worse. One of those details was the note from the neighbor Marlene about the truck. Another was something Bill saw himself the morning of the 3rd day. He'd gone out early before the teams gathered, hoping to get ahead of the fog. As he was walking back from the inlet, he heard what sounded like an engine turning over somewhere up the ridge. Not a boat motor. A truck maybe. Maybe a winch. He couldn't pinpoint it. Said it stopped after 30 seconds. And when he mentioned it later, the deputy chalked it up to hunting gear or generator noise from the private cabins. But those cabins were empty, Bill said. I checked most of them myself. He offered to take me back out there in the spring once the thaw hit. "I don't move as fast as I used to," he said, "but I can still follow a tree line." I said I'd like that. As I was getting ready to leave, he paused by the door and added, "You know your mom. She wasn't the kind to spook easy." I nodded. She had a good head on her shoulders. I remember that from the one time we met. She asked sharp questions, paid attention to details. If something felt off that day, I'd bet she knew it. Driving back downstate that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that Bill had told me more than he realized. Not in words exactly, but in tone. In the way his voice changed when he talked about the land, the water, the way things ought to behave when left alone. The only way that boat could have ended up in that creek was if someone had moved it there, someone who knew the roads, someone who had time to hide it far from where anyone would think to look. And if that was true, then the silence I'd lived with all these years wasn't just grief. It was cover. I got home late, made tea, sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open and the light low. I drew a rough map of the lake, the inlets, the distance from the launch to the creek. Then I added a second layer, logging roads, dry channels, trails that hadn't been on any official search grid. Bill said those old paths had surfaced during the drought, exposed for the first time in decades. That gave someone a window narrow but possible to move a boat through the forest without being seen. And if they moved the boat, what else had they moved? I didn't have answers yet, but I had direction. And a name. Not just Bill's, but someone else's mentioned once almost in passing by one of the older deputies during a local news segment from '87. A mechanic named Pete Sullivan claimed to have seen a familiar truck the day Mom and Caleb disappeared. Said it belonged to a man named Earl Hutchins. I didn't recognize the name. Not then. But it stuck with me. Something in the way he said it. Like it was a loose thread waiting to be pulled. I wrote it down. Underlined it. Twice. I didn't know much about Earl Hutchins when I wrote his name down. Just that he'd owned a beat-up truck that someone remembered seeing near the launch that week, and that a mechanic named Pete Sullivan had vouched for his whereabouts. That alibi never sat right with me, not just because of the man's name, but because of how clean it all sounded. And when I finally found Pete still alive, still in Michigan, living in a care facility in Cedarfield, I started to understand why. His voice had that hollow quality some people get after too much time in silence. Like everything he said had to be pulled through layers of memory just to reach the surface. He didn't seem surprised when I introduced myself, just nodded slowly and said, "This is about the lady and the boy, isn't it?" He remembered the day like it was still hanging in the air. Told me Hutchins came into his garage about a week before it happened. Asked if Pete would be willing to say he'd been there on the 15th just for a couple of hours. Offered $500 cash, said it was for insurance reasons in case someone asked. Pete said yes. Business was slow. He had bills piling up. And he didn't think twice about it until the news broke. At first, he didn't tell anyone, not when the search started, not even after the funeral. But over time, he started thinking about things differently. Said Hutchins came back around a few days later, nervous, asking if Pete had stuck to the story. That's when I knew it wasn't just a stupid favor he told me. But even then, he stayed quiet. And now, after all those years sitting in that sunlit room with a blanket folded across his lap, he said he couldn't carry it anymore. I kept thinking someone else would say something he said, but nobody ever did. I asked if Hutchins had mentioned anyone else. Pete hesitated, then nodded. 2 brothers, he said. Carl and Dave Moley, local guys. Hung around the lake scene back then. Worked odd jobs, mostly under the table. Pete didn't know them well, but he'd seen them with Hutchins more than once, especially in that summer of '87. The way Pete told it, the whole thing wasn't supposed to be violent. They'd been watching the boat launch for a while, scoping out out-of-towners trying to find an easy mark. The plan was simple. Follow a small boat out to a quiet part of the lake, take whatever gear they had, and leave the people on shore, or on one of the little islands stranded, maybe scared, but alive. Pete said Hutchins mentioned the kid like he was an afterthought. Didn't expect a kid to be there, he remembered him saying. Messed everything up. The more Pete talked, the clearer it became that something had gone wrong, something big. They thought they could scare her, he said quietly. But she knew him, called him by name, said something about his mother. That stopped me cold. Because my mother wouldn't have just recognized someone from the lake. She must have known him from town, from years back. Maybe church, maybe the market, maybe from when Dad was still alive. But whatever she said, it changed everything. Pete said Hutchins panicked, claimed the boat rocked hard during the struggle. The boy slipped in. The woman dove after him. Neither came back up. That's how he told it. Like it was some tragic accident they'd had to clean up. But it wasn't an accident, not by any definition I've ever known. And what came next, what they did after, was calculated. Pete said they didn't call for help. Didn't try to explain. Just dragged the bodies into another boat, gathered every piece of evidence, life jackets, gear, even the cooler, and got out. They took the long way through the forest, used the exposed logging roads the drought had revealed that year, the ones Bill had shown me on the old map. They drove the boat deep into the eastern woods to a dry creek bed no one would think to search, and left it there. Then they buried my mother and Caleb somewhere nearby. Pete didn't know the exact spot. Just said it was near an old logging camp that had been abandoned since the '60s. A place you'd only find if you'd spent years hunting or hauling out there. But he remembered one detail that stopped me. He said they buried them with the jackets still on. Said it was the only way to make sure no one found anything floating. I left the care home in a fog. Sat in my car with the heat off and my hands on the wheel staring at the windshield like I was waiting for something to move. It had been 20 years, and now I knew not just what happened, but how deliberate it had been. How quiet. I thought about my mom, how strong she'd been, how much she must have known in those final moments. And I thought about Caleb, just 9 years old, bright vest, little shoes, sitting in that boat with his lunch and his fishing pole, thinking it was just another summer day. That night I called Bill, told him what Pete had said, every word of it. He didn't interrupt. Just let me talk. Then he said, I know where that camp is. The next morning, I contacted a woman named Janet Cross, retired investigator, known for working cold cases. Bill had heard about her through an old mutual friend. She was thorough, blunt, and had a reputation for chasing leads no one else would bother with. When I told her what Pete had shared, she asked for a meeting, brought her own copy of the maps, her own questions, and a quiet, focused look that made it clear she believed me. She told me that if we were going to prove this, we'd need more than stories. We'd need physical evidence, something that showed intent, something that matched Pete's account, and maybe, just maybe, something left behind. Janet's first move was to interview Pete herself. Then she went back through the original reports, eyewitnesses, timeline, the position of the boat, the supposed drift path. She started noticing all the same contradictions that had haunted me for years. Then she took the photo album, the one Tommy Morrison had found in the boat wrapped in plastic. She had it analyzed for prints aging and one other thing, handwriting, because tucked between 2 pages, wedged in like a scrap of thought, was a note. 4 words. In my mother's writing, we are not alone. That was the first time I let myself cry, not just out of grief, but out of recognition. Because even in the worst moment, she had tried to leave something behind. A marker, a clue, something to tell us she hadn't gone without knowing what was happening. Janet kept pushing, dug into the brothers' names, looked for old records, former addresses, anything that might place them in the area back then. Carl Moley had died in a car wreck in '91. No witnesses, straight road, clear weather. The report called it an accident, but Janet flagged it anyway. Dave Moley had left Michigan the year after that. No forwarding address, no social security records past 1993. As if he'd vanished. Which meant the only man left, the only one still breathing, still answerable, was Earl Hutchins. And he was living in a trailer park outside of Jackson, 50 miles from the lake. Still in state, still free. When Janet and I pulled up in her truck that afternoon, the wind was low and dry. The kind of wind that carries dust across the past like it's trying to bury something. Hutchins opened the door in a t-shirt and work pants. His eyes locked on Janet first. Then me. I said my name. He went still. Then he said I already talked to the cops back then. I don't owe anybody anything else. Janet didn't flinch. She asked if he remembered June Whitlow and her grandson. His jaw tightened. He said, that was a long time ago. And when she brought up the boat in the creek, the one no one was supposed to find, he stepped back just slightly. Not fear, exactly, but recognition, like a door had just been opened behind his eyes. He told us to leave, said he had nothing more to say. But I saw it. Janet saw it too. That crack in his voice, that sliver of guilt he couldn't quite keep buried. We didn't push it, not that day. We had more to do, and the next step wasn't a confrontation. It was the woods, the logging roads, and the place where silence had been kept for too long. We had the names, we had the route, and now we were going to find the ground they never wanted disturbed. The soil out there doesn't give much back. That's what Bill said the morning we loaded into Janet's SUV, maps and coffee cups between us, the GPS blinking uncertainly as we followed a path barely visible beyond the tree line. We weren't bringing much, just field gear. Janet's camera, and a printed section of the old topography maps Bill had kept from his DNR days. But we didn't need much. The real work would be done by the team Janet had already coordinated cadaver dogs' radar equipment, a small forensic crew from a cold case unit she'd built ties with years ago. She'd pulled more strings than I ever knew existed to make it happen. No one from the sheriff's office was with us that day. Janet had notified them formally, but we both understood what kind of priority a decades-old disappearance carried in a quiet corner of the state. It would be easier for everyone if we found nothing, but we weren't there for easy. The access road we turned down was more memory than trail. Bill navigated by gut and markers I never would have noticed an old metal stake rusted halfway into a birch, the shift in tree growth where pines thinned out into poplar. The last half mile we had to hike on foot, picking our way through bramble and patches of late snow, the air damp and still. The dogs and their handlers were already ahead, combing through a grid Janet had mapped out the night before. It was quiet work. Just the shuffle of boots, the low murmur of radio check-ins, the occasional crack of branches underfoot. I stayed behind the main group near Bill, watching the tree line for, I don't know what. A sign, a movement, something human that had gone untouched by time. The site itself was just north of a dry ravine, maybe 200 yards from what used to be the outer boundary of a logging camp. The buildings were long gone, just impressions in the earth and a few scraps of timber overgrown with moss. But the layout was still clear if you knew how to look. Bill did. He moved slowly, cane in one hand, but his eyes tracked the land like he'd never left it. When the first dog signaled ears rigid, pacing in tight circles near a fallen oak, we all stopped. Janet gave a small nod, radioed the crew leader, and crouched to mark the location. They brought in the radar, next slow sweeps of the soil that turned up anomalies, shifts in density depth shapes, inconsistent with rock or root. No one said the word grave out loud. They didn't have to. The digging started around noon. Careful, controlled, measured in inches. Every movement documented, every layer sifted. I kept my distance at first. Just watched. The silence wasn't heavy, it was focused, almost reverent. And then close to 2 hours in, someone called Janet over. She waved me in with a glance, no words. What they uncovered was small at first, just the edge of a bright orange strap threaded through the soil like something trying to surface. It took another hour before both life jackets were visible, dulled and worn by time, but unmistakable. The remains beneath them were partial but clearly human. One set, larger one small. They weren't placed side by side. More like they'd come to rest near each other after being lowered quickly, not with care. The jackets were still buckled. One of the zippers had been jammed halfway up, the teeth twisted like someone had tried to adjust it too fast. They found my mother's purse next, still intact enough to identify. Her license inside. A few faded dollar bills, a single house key, and buried deeper, wrapped in cloth that had nearly disintegrated, a small black recorder, the kind you'd give someone as a gift back then, something to capture stories, little thoughts, reminders. Janet didn't say anything, but I saw her hand tighten around it when she picked it up. She passed it straight to the forensics team, and they sealed it without comment. I didn't ask if it would still work. I didn't allow myself that hope. Not yet. That night, we stayed at a roadside motel about 20 minutes from the site. Janet spent hours on calls, chain of custody reports, court protocol, arranging for the remains to be formally identified. I sat outside with Bill for a long time under one of those flickering motion sensor lights near the vending machine. He didn't say much. Neither did I. Eventually, he looked over and said, "Your mom was brave. Braver than most folks." I just nodded. It took 3 days for the lab to confirm what we already knew. Dental records matched. The bodies were my mother's and Caleb's. The trauma markers were consistent with a struggle, some bruising, one fractured wrist. The experts said it looked like they'd both been alive when they hit the water. that something pulled them under or prevented them from surfacing. But the most compelling evidence wasn't physical. It was inside the recorder. And somehow, despite years underground moisture damage and decay, they recovered just enough. The audio was degraded, warped in places, muffled by static. But there were stretches. Clear, heartbreaking stretches where my mother's voice came through like a ghost. She was teaching Caleb how to cast, laughing gently as he got tangled. You could hear birds, the slosh of water, the creak of the motor. And then it shifted. Her voice changed. Quieter. Uneasy. She says something like, "They're coming too close." Then she tells Caleb to put his life jacket on again. Tells him to stay near her. And then so clear it silenced the room. She says, "I know who you are, Earl Hutchins. Your mother would be ashamed." That sentence changed everything. It turned hearsay into evidence, circumstance into motive. The chain of events that followed moved fast. The cold case unit reopened the file. A judge issued a warrant for Hutchins's arrest. He was taken into custody without resistance, though from what Janet told me, he didn't say a word until he was sitting in front of a prosecutor. Even then, he tried to spin it. Said it wasn't supposed to happen that way. Claimed they panicked. That the water was too deep, the boat unstable, the kid just fell. But that tape said otherwise. And so did the timeline. So did the evidence buried with their bodies. A jury would hear all of it. But that was still to come. For now, the case was open again. The silence had been broken. And whatever came next, I knew we'd reached the part where the story could no longer be rewritten by rumor or assumption. The truth had a voice now. My mother gave it to us, and it was our job to carry it forward. The trial started on a Monday in early spring, 21 years and 9 months after my mother and Caleb left the dock and never came back. I sat behind the prosecution table every day, never once moving from the spot they gave me. Janet sat to my right. She didn't take many notes, didn't whisper much during proceedings. She just watched. Earl Hutchins came in through a side door each morning wearing a borrowed jacket and the same tired expression he'd had since the day of his arrest. He didn't look at me. Not once. I wasn't sure if that was guilt or calculation, but after everything I didn't need to know what he felt. I needed the jury to know what he'd done. The prosecution didn't waste time. They started with the recovered remains, the life jackets, the position of the bodies, the purse, the tape recorder. They called forensic analysts to testify about how long the items had been buried, how the soil protected the interior of the recorder just enough to make audio recovery possible. They showed the spectrograms pointed to the timestamps. They didn't play the tape aloud in court, not the whole thing. Just enough for the jury to hear my mother's voice and then that line. The one that changed everything. "I know who you are, Earl Hutchins. Your mother would be ashamed." Even now, hearing it, just that small segment was like standing at the edge of the water all over again. The courtroom stayed quiet for a long time after it played. The judge didn't even speak, just nodded for the prosecution to continue. They brought Pete Sullivan's video deposition next. He'd passed 3 months after Hutchins's arrest. Cancer finally took him, but not before Janet got his full statement recorded. The defense tried to paint him as unreliable, questioned his memory, implied he had motives for naming names so late. But the facts held. His details matched the evidence right down to the location of the creek, the existence of the dry logging road, the story of the payment. Pete hadn't needed to lie. If anything, he'd spent 2 decades living with the weight of not telling the truth sooner. And that came through in every frame of his video. The defense leaned heavily on the panic narrative, said it was never a planned crime, claimed the original plan was theft, not harm, that the deaths were accidental, that the decision to bury the bodies and move the boat was Hutchins acting out of fear. But every point they made came up short, because the only panic that day belonged to my mother trying to shield her grandson from 3 grown men. The jury heard about the life jackets being deliberately left on, about the quiet, calculated burial, about the boat being moved 8 miles through dense terrain. That wasn't panic. That was planning. That was control. On the 4th day, the prosecution showed a series of bank transactions from 1987. Small deposits into Hutchins's account, all cash. A new truck purchased 6 weeks after the disappearance. Expensive fishing gear from a shop in Flint. Nothing outrageous, but inconsistent with his reported income. They tied it to items believed to be taken from the boat. The cooler. The tackle. Even a vintage rod my mother had owned since the 70s, something I'd seen in photographs. It had turned up years later at a pawn shop, the serial number intact. That quiet line of evidence did something the testimony couldn't. It reminded the jury that this wasn't a ghost story. It was theft. It was greed. It was personal. When Hutchins finally took the stand, he stuck to the same script. That it was an accident. That he was just there. That the others, the Moley brothers, were the ones who escalated things. He said Carl panicked first, grabbed the side of the boat too fast, tipped it. That Dorothy slipped, hit her head. That the boy jumped in after her. That he tried to help. That it was already too late. But none of it matched what the evidence showed. And when the prosecutor asked him to explain why he never called for help, never reported what happened, never told a soul until he was cornered by truth, he just went quiet. They brought up Carl's death next. How it didn't sit right. The straight road. The dry weather. The way the truck veered. And then Dave's disappearance. No trace since '92. No taxes filed. No Social Security use. No confirmed sightings. The defense tried to dismiss it, called it irrelevant speculative. But even the judge let most of it in. Because those absences mattered. They spoke to the weight of what had been covered up and how long it had stayed that way. The verdict came on a Friday just before lunch. I didn't move when the judge read it. I just listened. Guilty on both counts, first-degree murder. 1 for my mother. 1 for my son. Life without the possibility of parole. When they led Hutchins out, he didn't resist. Still didn't look at me. Just kept his eyes forward and walked out as if none of it was his to carry. Maybe in his mind it wasn't. Afterward, I stepped outside into the cold March wind. Janet stood beside me holding a folder with all the press inquiries she planned to ignore. We didn't say much. She asked if I wanted a ride back to the motel. I told her I'd walk. It was only 8 blocks. I needed the air. Later that week I got a letter, postmarked from an out-of-state facility. No return name, just the initials E.H. I didn't open it. I tore it in half and put it in the trash without reading a word. Whatever he thought he needed to say, he had the chance to say it in court. And whatever part of him wanted forgiveness, it wasn't mine to give. The funeral for my mother and Caleb was held again, this time for real. The same church. Different season. New flowers. Their names engraved together on a shared stone just beneath the tree my father planted the year Caleb was born. People came from all over, neighbors. Classmates, old friends of my mom's who'd driven in from across the state. I said a few words. Not a eulogy, just a thank you. And when the service ended, I stayed behind long after the others had gone. Just me, the wind, and 2 bright orange life jackets folded at the base of the memorial. 1 adult, 1 child-sized. They didn't belong in storage. They belonged with them. But even with the verdict, even with the burial, not everything was finished. Dave Moley was still missing. The recorder proved my mother recognized Hutchins. But what she said before that, "We are not alone," left open the door that someone else had been there too. Maybe watching, maybe helping, maybe silent ever since. Janet hadn't closed the case file, and neither had I. Because justice isn't a light switch. It's something you carry, sometimes for a long time, sometimes forever. And sometimes even after the jury speaks, there's still one voice you haven't heard, one name you haven't found. One last step into the dark. It was 3 weeks after the sentencing when Janet called and said she'd found something. Her voice was low, measured, like she didn't want to get ahead of herself, but I could tell from the pause she left after the word found that it wasn't nothing. She asked if I could come to her office that afternoon. Not the station, her actual office, the one where they stored old evidence boxes and paper records in metal cabinets that barely opened anymore. When I got there, she had one of those boxes on her desk, already half unpacked contents spread out on manila folders like puzzle pieces without edges. I stood there for a second, not sure what I was looking at. She slid a photo across the desk and said, "Look close at the kid." It was a blurry Polaroid someone fishing from a dock. Early evening light, long shadow, the kind of thing you'd find at a garage sale and never think twice about. But when I leaned in, I saw what she meant. The boy was wearing a vest, orange, too big for him, and his hair lighter than Caleb's but the same cowlick. The dock didn't match anything I remembered, but it was stamped on the back August 87, Crawford County. She told me it came from a box of items seized from Carl Moley's house years ago, back when they searched the property in '91 after his truck accident. The box had been misfiled under a case number for a separate robbery. Nobody noticed because the inventory listed Maya C., photos and memorabilia, and nobody went back to connect it. Not until now. Not until someone reopened those inventory logs for the Hutchins trial. And even then, if Janet hadn't followed up herself, it probably would have stayed buried under layers of oversight and forgetfulness. She said she didn't want to speculate, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing I was, that this might have been taken after the day they disappeared, that someone, maybe Carl, had kept Caleb alive, even if only for a short time. That night I sat at the kitchen table with that photograph and turned it over a dozen times. The boy's head was tilted and his arm was raised like he was mid-cast. There was something about the way he was standing loose natural that made my chest tighten. If it was him, then it meant my mother had been right, that there was another presence that day. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone they hadn't seen coming. And maybe, just maybe, someone who took Caleb before the rest of it happened. The next morning, I drove out to Crawford County with Janet. We didn't call ahead, didn't want to raise attention until we knew more. She said there were still old permits on file for cabins near the lake where that photo might have been taken. A few had burned down. A few had been sold and rebuilt. One was still under the name of a man connected to a hunting club, a man who'd done occasional work with Hutchins and the Moley brothers in the late '80s. His name was Sam Lowry, retired now, lived in a small house near Grand Rapids. When we stopped by the cabin site, it was boarded up but intact. We walked around the back where the old dock still stretched out like a splintered finger into the gray water. I held the photo up and angled it to match the tree line. Same slope, same bend in the path, and then we saw it etched into the railing at the end of the dock, faded, almost worn smooth, but still visible. The initials CR carved with a pocket knife. Janet photographed it, took soil samples, marked the coordinates. She didn't say what we were both thinking, which was that none of this should have been here, that this dock shouldn't exist in a case file that was supposed to be closed. But it did, and it was real. And for the first time in months, I felt something I didn't know how to name. Not closure, not grief, something like a beginning that came too late. A week later, the recorder was returned to me. Not the copy, but the original. I don't know why I played it again. Maybe I needed to remind myself what she really said. Maybe I thought I missed something the first time. I sat in the living room with the curtains drawn and pressed play. The same wind, the same laughter, the same hush before the shift. But then, just before her voice drops into that low register, just before the accusation, there's a sound I hadn't caught before. A splash, maybe, or footsteps on wet wood. I replayed it 4 times. Each time it sounded different. But it was there, faint, distant, not from the boat, From the shore. I sent it to a private audio tech Janet had worked with during a cold case back in 2013. He cleaned it up and layered the channels. When he called me back, he didn't have a verdict, but he had a suggestion. He said it sounded like a boot hitting a dock. Then a pause, then a second splash lighter, like something was tossed or dropped. Not an accident, not a stumble, a sequence, a decision. And suddenly, I couldn't breathe. There was a theory forming now, one that didn't fit in the courtroom, one that didn't end with Hutchins alone. What if they'd planned to take the boat, but not the people? What if someone had walked down that dock and grabbed Caleb and that was the real trigger? What if my mother's last words weren't just defiance, but recognition, not just of Hutchins, but of someone else? Someone she hadn't expected to see again. Janet kept digging. She found 2 sets of partial prints on the inside of the recorder's casing. One was my mother's. The other didn't match anyone in CODIS. No one local. No one related to Hutchins or the Moleys. She ran it against old employment files from the marina. No hits. But something about the way she stared at the screen that day made me think she was close. She asked me if I remembered a man named Frank Delano. I didn't. She said he was listed once as a groundskeeper but left no trace after '88. Moved away, supposedly. No forwarding address, no tax records. Just gone. There was a receipt tucked inside one of the folders from Hutchins' glove box. A gas station in Alpena dated 3 days after the disappearance. Paid in cash. On the back was a scribble FD 1230 by Docs. I stared at it for a long time before Janet spoke. He was there, she said. We just don't know what part he played. That night I opened my closet and pulled down a box I hadn't touched since the first search. Inside were drawings Caleb had made. One showed a boat. Another a man with long arms and no face. Just a cap. I hadn't thought anything of it before. Kids draw strange things. But now I looked closer. In the corner in his tiny 5-year-old scrawl were 2 letters. FD. He'd written them backward like he hadn't known which way they went. But they were there. And suddenly I knew. Whoever Frank Delano was, he hadn't disappeared. He'd just been waiting. And if we wanted the last piece of truth, we'd have to find him. Before he found a way to vanish again. We found Frank Delano in a mobile home park just outside Joliet, Illinois. He was going by a different name, but the print match from an old arrest record finally gave Janet what she needed. He was older than I expected. Thinner. Looked like someone who'd been hiding for a long time but didn't know how to stop. When they brought him in, he didn't resist. Just sat there with his hands folded like he'd already seen the end of it. He didn't deny knowing Carl or Hutchins. Said he used to clean the boats, do odd jobs, keep to himself. When Janet asked him about the cabin, about the photo, he didn't answer right away. Just looked down at the table. Then he said something I still think about. He said, "Some things stay quiet longer than they should." There wasn't a confession. Not in the way you'd want. But there was enough to reopen the case around Caleb's disappearance. Enough to bring closure even if we didn't get the full truth. Janet found records of a cash withdrawal $500 from a joint account Delano had access to dated 2 days before my family vanished. She traced it to a rental in Crawford County under a false name. It matched the timeline, matched the dock, and matched the silence I'd been living in for over 30 years. The state declined to prosecute. Too much time, too many gaps. But for me, the point wasn't a trial anymore. It was the knowing that my brother had been taken, not lost. That my mother hadn't imagined the presence on the shoreline. That something happened after they found the boat, but before the world decided it knew what happened. I stood at that dock again last fall. Leaves turning, sky gray enough to hold your breath. I brought a photograph of Caleb, the real one, not the Polaroid, and placed it near the carving. CR, still visible, still quiet. I thought maybe that was the point. That memory doesn't always come with justice, but it can still hold weight. It can still ask something of you. Janet retired last month. She sent me a note on her last day. It just said, "He mattered. They all did." I think about that more than I expected to. Not just because of Caleb, but because of what stories like his reveal when someone finally listens. That grief isn't just about what's gone, it's about what's never been answered. And healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up to remember. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it, so no name gets left behind.